That's all. Gishi Benjime Wangela, Matsox for the Lapta Chimoda, Matsuwson Goblingla, paper Nyantopani Gaujon, any Matsunde put on Himalaya Ripagitini, Tandani Wosana, Yore, the Matsutan and any Kerang Penny, Matsola, Puki, Sombrikakola, Sonshitino, Nyantopani to Chishuian. So we are honored to welcome Geshe Berinjimela today here to Oxford and to Wolfson. Geshe is a lecturer at the Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies at Saranati, in India. And at the same institute, he's also the head of the Center for Tibetan Literature. He's a very respected scholar and author and has written quite a lot, prolifically, on topics ranging from Tibetan history and Buddhism to Tibetan literature and literary history. Actually, incidentally, about, a decade ago, in 2009, I think I had the honor and pleasure to actually edit a very dense and illuminating article Geshe wrote on the rise and fall of Beri King, Beri Jawogi Targul, with the late scholar Wim van Spingen, in a volume called Studies in Eastern Studies, kind of in the history of Eastern Tibet. So we co-edited that volume, and Geshe contributed to this incredible article. So today, Geshe is here to give us, to share with us a tiny dose of his vast knowledge of Tibetan literature. In this introductory lecture or talk, he would like to focus on six key issues: the definition or categorization of Tibetan literature, its development or its trajectory, its scope, legacy, lacuna, and the role of Tibetan women. So Geshe, please enlighten us.
And Oxford University, Chula Lota Chamber Nalola, and Nankama Orika Choda, then Bramba, and Kama Lamashalate, then Lelo Jepe Doje, Trebekaruchi, Tebe, Number Hejela, Ne Kokan de Tuchen, number Sol, and Sandy Shubi.
I would like to say hello to everyone, for Professor Ulrika Rosler and Dr. Lamajab and Helong Rinpoche, and all of you for being here, and I would like to say hello.
And Young Rinpo Oxford, Chula Chamber said, Mombo Kodea, Nitum Dun de Len in a Indina Lea Tasa Dunume, Tari. London level doctor to Chene, number two Kodi one, Lord Chamber Digan Holola, Pig somebody got Toshichi, Shuji Shumbating in the Siena, K Chamber Shadais.
I have heard of the fame of Oxford University far away, but I was here, I got the opportunity to come here in 2009, but didn't get an opportunity to speak here, and today I have got this opportunity, and you organized this event, and I regard this as a great opportunity.
Then Nagi indication me and Chesa Namasola Gonseshi and Chesa Kiri Shambichi Twana shake the number sol Nyoto Chasi Kisi Peket and the numbers of Kona, nyoto chene ma changzing she tui ina ya ta ki shenda ji lu ton ro gidi kala nyoto na te cha se ne gongse shu yi.
And I would like to apologize to everyone for not being able to speak in English. If I try to speak in English or in a foreign language, you might find my talk boring or anything. But and through the translations and everything, if I happen to bore you or anything, so I would like to apologize in advance.
Ina ya ngateri londo ju chili ya keju ane bramba lama cha rabre chi chene ge keza sha wale ya ji de ta dong se de tang si ge ndi isane nga lo de won de so.
It's my luck today to have Dr. Lamajab as my translator, so he might actually, his translation might be better than my own speech. So then I'm very happy with that. I don't think that would be the case.
Gongsi shugwa chela nga da chi ge ane da lama sha ge ju zo jana te ki ta ki zo na ji chang de 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 te ring gongsi shugwa yi.
I don't need to translate that. I would like to apologize for making Dr. Lamajab translate my talk.
Tene ring ta xie ngon zu chi nge te ta xie che ya ge ji ji de be ji zang li guo yi.
Today I'm going to talk about Tibetan literature.
Ane te ji ji de tense zhu ge tuan ya cha ji zo je tense dong bo de be ji zang li ge ning zi che ya de ye ba de be ji zang li ge ka shu guo de san ba de be ji zang li ge qi qi guo de ye ba de be ge zang li ge cha ce guo de nga ba de be ji zo li dong cha guo de zhu ba de be ji zo li de bi me ba ge zha wa de yi.
So today I have got 6 points that I would like to focus on in my talk. First, I would be focusing on the kind of categorization or definition of Tibetan literature. Second, I'll be focusing on the direction or the trajectory of Tibetan literature. And third, I'll be focusing on the distinctive features or qualities of Tibetan literature. And fourth, the scope of Tibetan literature. Fifth, the lacuna of Tibetan literature, and third, the role of Tibetan women.
Tene big example de jia chu chu ma re jia qianbo ji de lu ji xu tu tu ma re ha jiang rinbo ji de ane xi jia ge qi chu ma re xi jia ge qianbo ji de.
So Tibetan literature has a long history, vast scope, and in terms of field of studies, it is immense.
Dense dambo de big example in the chia la cha chu ge lu che ne ngi zi chia ji da cha chu ge lu che ne ngi zi chia wa ni ye be no lo ne ngi de ri chia se cha chu ge on de che ne ngi zi che tong te shu ge yi.
So in terms of definition of Tibetan literature, one could have a kind of a broader definition or interpretation of Tibetan literature and a narrower definition of Tibetan literature. And today I would be kind of adopting a broader definition of Tibetan literature.
Page somebody yongzu short ji de dang xia na ane number ni su chong ge de dong bo de ji zang de ni ba de wu zang de.
So maybe if we kind of conflate or integrate all the Tibetan kind of literary works into 2 categories. One, we're talking about translated literature that come out of translation efforts, and secondly, indigenous literature.
Tongbo jitsam tela bebe ge na lo ya ta zhou ge rang shi dian ba dang yu liu ge rang shi dian be ge zang bi ane gan ju be jia ha zi yo de ding ju be ni jia ha zi yo de.
And first, in that category, under that category, if we talk about translated literature, we have the canonical Tibetan literature formed of the translated words of Lord Buddha and the translated commentaries of it. In terms of translated words, we're talking about 100 volumes. In terms of translations of the commentary, we're talking about mounting about 200 volumes.
Somebody there's a kind of ju re se na ja ga ne chi ji ju then Kashmiri Majinjo, Jana Yajinjo, Mancha, the Peshetis on the degrees.
So where are the source languages of these translations? They're from India, from Kashmir, and some from China.
Ki Tony Shena, and a Lezaki Tony, and a Pali Ki Tony, Jana Ki Tony Joa, Pesha, the Mister degrees.
In terms of language, we're talking about Sanskrit, Pali, and Chinese.
Zambi Jeji Kashu Tony Shana, Pesha, the Nandiri Begoris.
In terms of the topic or theme, most of the main topics of this literary works is the content is Buddhism.
Zambi de Beke to Jingi Tony Shana, Halam Rozawa, Nijada, Nishisunchi, Chung.
So in terms of the translators, we're talking about translators numbering 220 to 30 great translators who are involved in translating these works.
And it's something there's a Java Yang, Jaga painted the bell, pay you here want to down the Shana, Master down the job to do the pay you this.
And those, in terms of the Indian Panditas, great Indian masters who contribute to these translations, we're talking about 107 great Panditas, Indian Panditas, who contributed to the translation effort. And so these comments are just kind of a great summarized statements. I'm just summarizing some of the statements. So in terms of indigenous composition, indigenous literature, I'm talking about literary works authored or composed by Tibetans themselves.
Don't say somebody. Such a cambo pod the jonga name go to Satine, then Portuguese cambo. The name of Jas is so cambo last hope, that Shodam Jana or the Tonga Hayoris.
So I don't have time. I mean, we can't go into details of these literary works, and if we talk about the Satya school of Tibetan Buddhism, we're talking about the 15 great volumes of canonical works. And then in terms of Jeyapsism, we're talking about several volumes. And all together, we're talking about, I think, thousands of great works. So just to kind of to make a very brief comments about Tibetan literature, we're talking about these are some of the forms that constitute Tibetan literary works, Tibetan literature. So one thing I forgot to say, I mean, that's we're talking about the Tibetan literature constituted of literary works and indigenous Tibetan literature. And so second focus, we're going to talk about the direction or trajectory of Tibetan literature. So here we're talking about three key main categories. That first, we're talking about the Tibetan kind of ancestral poetry. Second, Tibetan classical literature. Third, Tibetan free verse or new literature, including free verse.
Then Tambo Peggy maybe Nyanga Tinolo and Shana and a big Timbi Tira Kagi, Nyanga Mongoyore, Pesivi Tira Kalsiana, Mabalo Zawada, and Malaja Dojela Sope, ane nyanga mombo yores.
If we talk about the Tibetan kind of ancestral literary tradition, we're talking about all the great poetry coming from the Tibetan imperial period, also great poetry composed and sung by like Marba Lozawa, Milarepa. All those are part of the Tibetan ancestral literary tradition.
Tene mipi nyanga no ta tira kidi choje ni shuchi chesho atambo de se chabare sena chayang jangsa chabare.
So in terms of if you come down later, kind of more recent 17th and 18th century, one of the most influential literary figures is Chayang Gyamso.
Digi shuchi ne
Sixth Dalai Lama.
Digi shuchi ne tande pad mechen bawa nangshi dang ane cha chowa nangshi yores.
So that the literary influence of Chayang Gyamso is still flourishing, still enduring, and still it's roaring like a flame.
Tene nipa de soju ge zamri ge thola shugi soju ge zamri ge thola ane shuji cheshu de suchong bare sana sacha pendita ganga janse chong bare.
Second category is the classical Tibetan literature, and the most influential scholar is Satyapantita.
Tene soju ge zamri tela kashu mandawa ni chabare.
So we have got, in classical literature, we have got two subcategories.
Digu jinse ne soju ge zamri de jaga la kutu bare jaga ge zamri tela jaga hove ge zamri da jaga chave ge zamri mandawa ni yores.
The reason being that the classical Tibetan literature is derived from Indian literature, Indian literary traditions. And in Indian literary tradition, there was this convention to divide it into the South tradition and the Eastern tradition of Tibetan literature. Not Tibetan, sorry, Indian literature.
Tende chane begi zamri tela ya ane kamandawa ni chong bare. Begi mi soju zamri tela kamandawa ni chong
So
bare.
for that reason, in terms of Tibetan classical literature, also it has got two kind of types. It divided up, kind of two divisions, two categories.
Jaga shabi lu ge zamri ge shuchi cheshu de ane kedu gele peso dan shuju chingu chaba tabu chong bare.
So under the influence of the Eastern tradition of the kind of Indian literary tradition is that we're talking about Gendon Drupa and Shanshung
kedu gele peso dan
Kidub Gelik Pesang and
shuju chingu chaba.
Shanshung Chung Drupa. These are the kind of two great Gelu masters, no?
Yeah. Then jaga hove ge zamshi ge thone shena shuchi chishu de sacha pente da ganga janse da je chong kha ba ta bare.
And in terms of the influence of the South Indian literary tradition, we're talking about great Satyapantita and Jetsongkhapa.
Zambi dig shuchi ne bebe ge nolo la ta karso shin ji ge mane nolo la ta nyanga ge chase de chishu ne de yores.
It is under these two kind of literary trajectories that had a huge influence on the Tibetan intellectual life and Tibetan kind of literary practitioners.
Bege zambi ge kashu sambate zari sabate res.
And the third category, or third trajectory of Tibetan literature is the new Tibetan literature.
Tene tira nyeshibe lara jashine bela jene tango chubares.
That is, we're talking about the kind of start, the emergence of it is in the 1980s of the 20th century.
Tene digi kunjawade nishu padang jana ni tuderes.
So the source of that literary kind of literature is, we're talking about the West and China.
Tene shuche de ngonju chenge de be nolo shena tendu ja konzores.
And the kind of pioneer of that literary development is Dondubja and his peers.
대 배나로 숑베기 저리 사바 슈동기 내주지레스.
So this is a development that took place inside Tibet, and a new kind of innovative literary development spearheaded by Tibetans inside Tibet.
이나야 배실로라 안에 베기 저리 사베 원주 제야데 디라니시 라라 든치는 원주에서 차버리스.
But in terms of the outside Tibet, in Tibetan diaspora, we're talking about new Tibetan literary forms were emerging in the 1970s.
근데 배실로라 저리 사방 원주 쟁에데 스모 추자 중파를 못치 공기 원주 제버리스.
So the literary pioneer outside Tibet, in Tibetan diaspora, is Chuje Trungpa Rinpoche.
근데 댄스 선바 배지 점리 치치고 있어.
Our third point that I would like to talk briefly is the distinctive features of Tibetan literature.
강데 시바나시기 배기 점리라 카슈 만다와 예바나시기 카슈로로 소살라 만다위 치치요리스.
So as I have mentioned about different categories, trajectories of Tibetan literature, and all these different trajectories has their own kind of distinct qualities.
배기 미비저리다 질 차샤니 시나 미비저리데 차단로서 조치어데 이주리 자체 몽초고 나로라 차단로고 요리스 배제 단계 요리스.
So in terms of ancestral Tibetan literary tradition, ancestral Tibetan literature, the kind of the readers of it's been received by the common people. The scope, so it's most popular and most being kind of enjoyed by common people, by the general public.
이주리 진소 나로라 배제 동야 대야 잠블리 샹다 스키다 만데웨기 안 니피냐가 배제 동도 되다 배발라 토모 많이 봐요 리스.
근데 야치 소노가
이주리게 디
아지르라
이주리 자체 몽초고 나로라 안에 배기 미피냐가데 바배제 동도데 미세 토모 많이 봐요 리스.
And the kind of enjoyment or the practicing and the reveling in poetry by common people, and the reception of this traditional kind of ancestral poetry is itself is something that is very unique. One would say maybe kind of singular. The Tibetan kind of common people's enjoyment of this poetry is quite distinct. Yeah.
Then 이주리 자체 몽초라 냥아 랑이 요 말에 냥아 튕이 요 말에 냥아가 혼세 요 말에 냥아가 호자 요 말에 로주 회식이 냥아한테 소식이 생각나는 척바와 나지 지는 말레기 요리스.
So when we're talking about kind of common people or ordinary people, there were no kind of specific trained, skilled experts teaching poetry, telling them how to practice, or there are no any kind of theoretical introductions to Tibetan poetry, but it is a spontaneous outpouring of poetic creativity.
Pena 신칼랭게 지이나 땡칼레베 까라 땡칼레 바단자와 예비치데 소소 조고 요레 동동고 요레 땡칼 동베 까라 다가 동고 요레 신카모베 까이 장 동베 까이나 레카 치수 간지 기존나 데게 자로라 롱슈기 소소기 냥아치 장용고레 대동용데 동땡용고레.
For instance, if we talk about kind of like farming, during like harvesting and things, farmers compose their own songs, their own words for the songs. Not only that, actually the tune and the melody improvise. So there's this kind of continuous improvisation going on, and both labor songs and kind of labor poetic compositions that is improvised for the purpose, for whatever purpose, for farming or for construction, all that are happening simultaneously in a natural kind of way.
Tene, Deya, Niba Chushumare, nipa chenpo de peche chung mare peche chenpo yores.
So that's something that not just a small effect it has a small power, it has got a huge power. It has, and not only it has got a kind of narrow, small use, but actually it has kind of a great use, great purpose.
Division son koyu de imore jasha denchu jashigi igi shingi yo mare. Ina ya posachi do masachi 팔수 jawa che gugu yana xie tangu yo. Xie gi chi langi yo mare soso gi saba zogu yo. Ani dong yinbu tone tong yung de kala ka te de kala wi cha de senge da wa sa senge da ka ba ku da ka ke yo mare. Ina ya xie gi dong yinbu de di de na zo 카박 챙겨버려. 디 너로 치대 랑이 요마래. 소소 제동 치대 소소 파당 치당 미치게 타지에데 아니 되게 미빈양 같은 타 지어요.
And if we think about traditional Tibet, in terms, most people were illiterate. We're talking about 70 or maybe above % of the population were illiterate. So, but still, if say a man and woman kind of have a romantic relationship, interaction, they sing each other, they sing songs to each other, but they improvise lyrics for that song. There's nobody that teaches them what to sing or what specific words to sing out, but they themselves make up these words, improvise these words. And that's how they establish the relation. In those days, as you know, there are no social media, WeChat or what else, Twitter or anything else, and that's the only mode of communication that one uses to establish romantic relationship through poetry, through ancestral poetry.
근데 냥아 지보 많이 봐. 때 양태야. 양의 차야 안에 제서 된데게 하장에 다 자제보다 하장의 뱀벨을 때 배난시기 머리 생각 표시하지 말아요.
And in terms of that poetic kind of lyrics, words, we're not talking about just the poetic composition of these songs, but they're accompanied by tunes, by melodies, by music. So it's infused with music. So it's really Tibet, I would think, Tibetans would be very, very unique, would be quite hard to find any other people, maybe, that would have this kind of poetic richness and diversity.
근데 maybe 냥아가 놀러네 다 수치 체쇼 지대 가르래서나 리동레스.
Langdong.
리동 리케사가 동.
Ale, Langdong. Yeah, that's Lidong. Yeah. And another subcategory of ancestral literature or literary tradition is the Geshe epic, the Tibetan epic.
근데 리동티기 놀러라 베베기 정성 차와 체야기 니바 미세와 요래라 미기 솔리카쇼 주야 니바 미세지 요래서
미그 카레?
솔리카쇼 주야.
In epic poetry, in Tibetan epic poetry, it not only has a representation of Tibetan society, but it also has the power to shape human thought.
그렇지. 다 니바데 소지 장비기 치치카시스 쇼이 있어.
In this, the second subcategory, I would like to just say a few, single out a few distinctive features of classical Tibetan literature.
근데 소지 장비의 비배신성은 조치와 강조고 요래서나 안에 로용연에게 고유다 게데 자존을 망치야 되지 당그 요래서.
So in terms of the environment of the classical Tibetan literature, or the kind of consumers of this classical Tibetan literature, we're talking about educated Tibetans, and mostly in monastic institutions.
배쇼 동토대야 점벌리 현다도 만다위게 미세유여레스. 아니 냥아레레데 맞동사 몸보고 냥도 쇼야 마라니 마라파도 lo jacha mambo ro chana nyanga ta tadu pa de man thane sho de nyanga tande mambo yoris.
But in terms of use of this kind of poetic compositions, there's also quite unique, very singular way of using and kind of enjoying, consuming these poetic compositions. Some poems, there are actually quite a lot of poems that have been recited and sung and chanted over hundreds of years, has been performed kind of orally like that for centuries, and that's quite a unique way of kind of receiving these poetic works.
Zambi shibun de lo nyanga shongne bale nyanga shongne nyanga chinde chinge ma siti yeji mari is.
They may not be in this huge world. They may not be as a people that kind of recites and reads poetry aloud as often as much as the Tibetans.
Tene nyanga sholu shoto tel patong ni shoya yang tan ni shoya tene ndurchi ni shoya shoto la mandawa mombo yoris.
So in terms of the recitation of poetry, we have got different types, different ways of reciting poetry. Poetry, kind of an oral rhythm of it, according to different tunes, or maybe singing it out with a long kind of pronounced melody, or with a different kind of maybe with a faster notes or tunes. So there are different ways of putting it to music.
Yede kazo pachewa tenalo la shoke chise nga wa ya mene yalang ne cho yore. Cho ne de kanga nyama shobi yore kanga.
So in all monastic institutions, the monks get up around 5 o'clock and they attend the congregation, attend masses and recite prayers and recite different texts. But all these recitations are poems. So they are reciting poetry.
Nyama shotong te yote. Tam chulu rolo soso ye tamara wa nimbo tende ye tone shobi yore.
So in terms of recitation, we're talking about depending on different monasteries, different monastic systems, they all have different ways or different tunes and melodies for reciting poetic compositions.
Kesa nyanga chende zoya zamdi shipi tola pevale maa siji yeji mare yes. Nyanga chende zo nyanga shoriya.
Yeah. In terms of recitation of Tibetan, maybe that not as many people or as much as in the world when we terms of maybe Tibetans are one of the greatest reciters of poetry.
Tene nyanga shoyate nge number zo jo ya chende chiche chi shobo la.
Okay, in terms of recitation of poetry, just to please you, to delight you, I'll recite one verse.
为然教一教育所所以马里爱买胖的爱这样爱教育爱这这一随时爱给了爱跟着一些爱呢也就爱真就爱老没爱做那爱啦并且介绍一个
That's one example.
大满照我的样满照被你查成的罗西里。
So in terms of different tunes or different melodies of that is set, different poems set to different melodies and tunes, there are lots of them. But my own monastery is Loseling College, monastic college is Loseling, and Loseling has got 64 melodies, different melodies for reciting poetic compositions. And then we're talking about there are hundreds of thousands of monasteries. This house we're amounting to. They all have different tunes and melodies. We're numbering them. That will total in thousands.
Cambridge University la teji shitsai yangcha chi kesa nganju ge yang thea te so teri kaso marina bo te so ge yang ji thea da nga me to shi de de so nganju khema ne yo re Pechashana Dedoa, Sawan de Bepe, Sawanange Bepe, Sawa Yachase Bepe, Sawa Bede Bepe, Sawa Tete Bepe, Sawa Peshatse Bepe. Marina Polo that is name, Nazimri the past solo Chadas solo down, Luso de Mava is in the lever, and Nassis in the Piano Yoris.
And if we talk about kind of performance, different kind of recital of poetry, something actually similar was happening, like kind of a rap music by black people, similar tunes, and Tibetans have actually had that kind of tunes a long time ago, but we didn't kind of maybe had the opportunity to publicize these different tunes, but as you can see.
I number Sala Gonse Sugar, she the Negi, Chuse Till Mess, she didn't do Tens of Tamatana, one and Mamatani, Joban Drogi.
Okay, so I'm running out of time, and I'll get on to the other points quickly.
Then say about the big Zambi Chassi, big Zambi Chassi, Chena, so the Nandegi Pare, then Nandegi Padan Tevik, then so I report the Jari about the Zari, the Dutch about the Pachavala Chadegi or this.
So in terms of the scope, the kind of the reach of Tibetan literature, we're talking about that it's covering that kind of Buddhist philosophy, and it also has Tibetan kind of language and grammar, and Tibetan arts and crafts. So it's kind of reaching to quite to different fields of Tibetan knowledge that's being subsumed by Tibetan literary works or in Tibetan literature.
Then say about the big Zambi Dongchashi.
The fifth point is the kind of lacuna of Tibetan literature.
Then big Zambi della Jitsi Pusova Yore, Yenaya, Zambi Dongcha Carriores, and Tanda Pred the Baby Logino, Madi Zambi, Chassi Zambi, Benjo Zori, Juto Zambi, Tsunde Zambi Singers, and the Baby Zori, Chapon Leo Maris.
So in terms of artistic diversity and kind of richness, Tibetan literature is kind of well endowed with these qualities. But when we think about, but there are also quite a lot of things that are lacking in Tibetan literature, lacuna, such as compositions on kind of on military matters, on warfare, on politics, on economics, on technology, on trade and commerce, or even on kind of construction. So there seems to be a big kind of missing gap in relating to these kind of topics and issues.
Yes, Baby so there, and the Zambali Shandagaya, Gil Mania, Nediti, Tusade, Toncha Tigi Chin and Anzo, Gimania or somewhat 10 years.
I believe that one of the reasons that Tibetan society is lagging behind the kind of modern world is because of this lacuna, because that Tibetan literature and literary creations kind of suffer from the kind of these shortcomings.
Yeah. They turning a Mahamba Pivik Zambi Tola, and a Tono Nongeda, Pivik Tori Tolia, Rapaz Ongeda, Pivik Zambi Tola, Ngen on Kitchina, Nedi taking Tongen on where the kitchen should reach us.
I believe that therefore it's very important for those who are interested in Tibetan literature, those who are kind of like lovers of Tibetan literature and would like to contribute to Tibetan literary studies. It's important to draw their attention to these issues.
Then said Drupa the Shuis, page it's only the Pimek, but in Java
Then on to my sixth point is the kind of relationship between Tibetan women and Tibetan literature.
They should go and say that and get then saying about the pig, it's only gay, don't chuck, 电视主播的效果的别的张宝给动产的这所东西写的是个意思。
Fifth, we're talking about lacuna of Tibetan literature, and the sixth are also the kind of lacuna coming to Tibetan authorship, literary authorship.
但呢，别个张宝的这些全部你个同的这有的，电脑呢当部节奏高的，节奏高了根据当根据别实际上最有的，对今年老早我家当老早我你家年是好最有的。对，今年老早我你家年是好做个老呢，比面光都既要嘛的是。
So, as I mentioned earlier, that one of the main components, constituents of Tibetan literature is translated literature. So that is the canonical Tibetan literature, which is translated. Translators, we're talking about over 220 translators who are responsible for the translation of this canonical literature. But there was, among this, there was not a single Tibetan woman translator.
因为北京的地拉告诉老早啊，他们上不着呢，我最呢，老早啊，农家弟兄把的，俺是当兵，老早啊，俺是俺姐从小，第一个呢，平面光都这样嘛的，但呢，老早啊，前上半年我最呢，俺呢，叫侬打了南他个把的，老早啊，家当俺是俺是从小，第一个呢，平面光都这样嘛的。
During the Tibetan imperial period, starting from Thomas Sambuddha himself to Namkha Tenchung, that Tibetan imperial period, there were 58 Tibetan translators, great translators. Not one of them was woman. And then the great, if we start a kind of later stage of Tibetan history, from Losawar Rinchen Zombo to great Dharanatha himself, we're talking about over 150 translators. Again, not a single Tibetan woman among them.
Then, you put the Jitsang forest. Mar Pevarang Tishon Jogi, Rosang College. Rosang College, you may get Kashi Junior at the Susresena, Lameki, Songi in Yedan, and Lameki, Donsi in Yedan, Kandroma in Yedan, Tormena in Kekipime, Kashi Papi Be. 비면 파베 노로네 안에 베베 장비 로진노를 템베기 다 디라 예식을 당을 하는 요 말이스.
And then the second main constitute of Tibetan literature is the indigenous Tibetan literature we talk about, that created by Tibetans themselves, authored by Tibetans themselves. And among these authors, women are few in number, very, very few, very rare. And those who composed or responsible kind of could be called authors. They're mostly either consorts of great lamas and masters, or might be heirs of great lamas, or maybe some kandomas, dakinis, and Jandadikare. Dongsi Kandoma and Torimana, yeah. So some kind of a hierarchy, high status, maybe some women that are kind of high status, but they are still very, very few.
그래서 인간들이 초안놈이 토는 데기 나라 국가 노연디 여기 토는 게 남아서를 계속 떠야 돼. 비베 정리 동찬데 세워줘야 치도 주의해서.
I forgot one thing actually. So we're talking about this literary kind of indigenous literature, so Tibetan themselves, literature created by Tibetan and produced by Tibetan themselves. So in terms of women authorship, as you can see, very few till the 20th century. So one of the reason that I came here today and talk about Tibetan literature, and especially focusing on this lacuna of Tibetan literature, is to stress this shortcoming, this big shortcoming.
그래서 디링이 각각 담수진이 쉬어야 돼. 남바진들은 평균 양조 안에 라르치모다 레와 연계 개발장제 있잖아요. 마음발라 넘버스 돈으로 줘야 돼. 자쇼서 줘야 카디슈나야 난절 냐바드 자쇼 좀보에도 돈은 노고야데 가르레세나 베베기 정리기 동차도 장바비기 동찬데니기 토라 냐바드 돈은 노로지스.
So today you're all here who are interested in Tibetan culture and literature, who kind of are experts in Tibetan literature. So my appeal is that I would like to urge you to focus and to draw your attention, especially to focus upon these lacunas, these shortcomings of Tibetan literature.
Tene am thade tela terena zo Baramba orikare taana je tene keju baramba je lamachare tene lenong jmuchere tene namba so yangzo la tere tamshe ge kwaka dende chi len chene namba so yangzo la tuji chese de shirei.
Yeah, I would like to thank Professor Ulrika Rosler, Lamachia, Helong Rinpoche, and yourselves for giving me this opportunity to give this talk and to coming to my talk, and thank you very much.
Tene ngegi chaji dawode kama jitla shuje kama nyeshla chawatle zoya chaji tibai ina chaji tiba nashi roma so tene kama ngatheba shosta kama changa tichendu and ane tirila chawatle kama chere sai kama chendu tichela chawatle ina noro cheswe.
So my plan was to speak for about 40 minutes and then give you opportunity to ask questions, to have maybe 20 minutes of question and answer. But I have run over, and we have 10 minutes, and if you would like to ask any questions.